The cry that split the pre-dawn chill of the Magnolia Grove plantation was thin, reedy, but unmistakably alive. In the cramped, airless cabin, Leah's world narrowed to sweat, pain, and a surge of raw, terrified love. Old Maria de Rosario guided the tiny being into the world, her practiced hands swift. But as she lifted the child, her breath caught. The other women crowding the small space drew back as one, a collective silent gasp hanging in the smoky air. Leah, exhausted, pushed herself up on her elbows. "My baby, let me hold my boy." Mariah's eyes, usually pools of weary calm, held a warning. She hesitated before turning the infant, swaddled in a rough, clean cloth. Leah's hands reached out, and the moment her fingers brushed the skin of his cheek, she knew. He was fair, not the deep, rich brown of her own skin, nor the tawny hue of many mixed children in the quarters. This was the pale, translucent white of the master's family, dotted with just a faint dusting of freckles across his nose. A perfect miniature echo of Master Shaniano. Panic, cold and slick, coiled in Leah's gut. This wasn't just a child of violation. This was a living, breathing accusation. In the big house, Mistress Estella was stirring her morning chocolate when the overseer Geronimo, a man built like a gnarled oak, appeared at the dining room door. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, his face grim. Estella's spoon clattered against the fine china. She knew. The rumors about Shaniano and the comely woman in the weaving shed had been whispers for months. She had chosen to ignore them, to bury her humiliation in the starch of her linens and the shine of her silver. But a baby was a fact that could not be starched or shined away. She found Shaniano in his study, pretending to review ledgers. "The slave Leah," she said, her voice like ice cracking. "She has delivered a boy." Shaniano didn't look up. His knuckles were white where he gripped his pen. "See that she is given an extra ration. For her strength." "You will look at him," Estella hissed, the veneer of composure shattering. "I have no interest." "You will." Driven by a fury that burned away all caution, she marched down to the quarters, Shaniano trailing behind like a condemned man. The enslaved people melting out of her path saw not just the mistress, but the storm in her eyes. She pushed into the cabin. Leah, clutching the baby to her chest, looked up. In that moment, 3 pairs of eyes met. Leah's, filled with defiant protection. Estella's, blazing with wounded pride. And Shaniano's, fixed desperately on the dirt floor. The silence was absolute. It was broken by the baby's soft mewl. Estella stared at the child's face, at the shape of the brows, the set of the tiny mouth. It was like looking at a portrait of her husband as an infant. All doubt vanished, replaced by a venomous certainty. "That thing," she whispered, then spun to face Geronimo, who loomed behind them. "Take it. Today. Sell it in town. I don't care to whom. I don't care for how much. I want it gone before the sun is high." The command hung in the air. Leah's cry was not a sound, but a force that ripped from her soul. She crumpled around the baby. Shaniano took a half-step forward, a strangled noise in his throat, but Estella's gaze pinned him to the spot. Geronimo moved with brutal efficiency, prying the infant from Leah's arms as if removing a branch from a stubborn knot. Leah was left on the packed earth floor, her arms terrifyingly light, her body screaming with the primal need to hold the child it had just made. The sun rose, painting the quarters in cruel, cheerful gold. Leah walked back from the big house yard, her steps slow, robotic. Her breasts ached, heavy with milk that had no destination. Maria and the other women formed a wall around her, not with words, but with their presence, a fortress of shared, silent understanding. That evening, in the master's dining room, the supper grew cold. Shaniano's hand, raised for the customary blessing, fell limply to his side. No words would come. The prayer was dead, and in the corner of the slave cabin, Leah on her knees began her own. She had no altar, no priest, just a name breathed into the darkness. "Isaias," she whispered, the first time his name had touched the air. "Wherever you are, remember me." The silence that settled over Magnolia Grove was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, of a wound clamped shut. For Leah, the world had become a muffled, gray place. The physical pain of her full breasts eventually subsided, replaced by a hollow ache that took up permanent residence in her chest. Her work in the weaving shed continued, her hands moving by rote, but her spirit was in a vigil. She began her secret rituals. Behind a loose brick in the cabin wall, she placed a stubbed candle end, stolen fat smoothed into a hollowed gourd. Each night, long after the others slept, she would strike a flint, and in that tiny, defiant flame she would pray. Not for vengeance, that was a luxury her faith could not afford, but for protection. "Holy Mother, you who lost your son, watch over mine. Let him know in his spirit that he is loved, that he came from love." Her prayers were not quiet pleas, but fervent, tear-soaked offerings. She would kneel until her legs numbed, whispering the name Isaias like a sacred incantation, pouring every ounce of her longing into the belief that love could travel unseen roads. In the big house, the silence festered. Estella ordered all the large mirrors taken down, claiming they made the halls dreary. But she could not remove the reflection in her husband's evasive eyes or in the polished surface of her tea. She started at small noises. The cry of a distant hawk became the wail of an infant. The wind in the magnolias whispered, "Isaias." Shaniano's guilt manifested as restlessness. He took to riding the boundaries of the plantation obsessively, as if he could outrun the specter of his own son. He could not look at Leah, and yet he found his eyes drawn to the weaving shed, watching the slump of her shoulders. His act of cowardice had birthed two ghosts, the boy sold, and the living woman whose pain was a constant, silent judgment. Desperate for a salve, he conceived a plan. He called Geronimo to him. "In town," he said, his voice low, "there is a child, a poor woman's babe, perhaps from the almshouse. Secure it. A charitable act, for the mistress. It will lift her spirits." It was a transaction, another purchase to erase the first. Geronimo returned with a swaddled infant, a sickly little girl with a somber gaze. When presented to Estella, she accepted the bundle with stiff arms. The child did not cry. She stared up at Estella with ancient, knowing eyes. The mistress felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. This was not a replacement. This was a reminder. The girl, named Clara by Estella in a moment of forced normalcy, thrived physically but remained preternaturally quiet. One sweltering afternoon, a fever seized her. She burned, her tiny body convulsing. The household was in an uproar. The doctor was miles away. From the quarters, Leah heard the frantic comings and goings, the muffled panic. A mother's radar, tuned to the frequency of a child's distress, pulled her to her feet. She approached the big house kitchen, not as a supplicant, but as a force of nature. "I can help," she said to the cook, her voice leaving no room for refusal. Brought to the nursery, Leah moved past the terrified housemaids and the paralyzed Estella. She saw the child burning up. Without a word, she took cool water and lavender from the mistress' own stores, bathing the small limbs, singing a low, rhythmic hymn in a tongue older than the plantation. She worked for hours, a portrait of focused compassion. As Clara's fever broke and she slipped into a healing sleep, Estella watched from the corner. She saw the tenderness in Leah's touch, the absolute absorption in saving a child that was not her own. In that moment, Estella's hatred curdled into something worse, a profound, shame-filled understanding. She had tried to break this woman, But Leah's capacity to love was unbreakable. The chains were on Estella's own soul. Far from Magnolia Grove, in a bustling river town, the child Isaias began his journey. He had been bought by Amancio Pruz, a merchant of middling wealth and great cruelty, who saw a fair-skinned slave child as a novel living accessory. Isaias' first memories were not of a mother's face, but of the rough homespun skirt of Almarinda, Pruz's elderly cook, who became his unwilling guardian. He was a quiet child, observant. He learned to read the moods of the house Pruz's thunderous rages, Almarinda's sighs of exhaustion. He felt in a wordless way that he did not belong. At night, he dreamed of a warm darkness and a voice humming a tune he could never quite remember upon waking. When he was 5, Amancio Pruz dropped dead at his own dinner table, his face frozen in a surprise that mirrored the shock of his few servants. The town murmured of a weak heart, but the older gossips nodded knowingly. That child, they'd say, brought from sin and sold with a curse. Bad blood finds its way home. With no heirs willing to claim a slave boy, Isaias was deposited on the steps of the Sisters of Mercy orphanage. Here, his world changed. The stern but kind Sister Matilda saw intelligence in his watchful eyes. She taught him his letters and numbers, and more importantly, she taught him of a God who was a father to the fatherless. Isaias excelled. He had a calm strength and a sharp mind. Yet, he often felt a strange duality, an outsider among the other orphans because of his lighter skin and careful speech, and an outsider to the world he read about in books. He felt a pull, a sense of purpose he could not name, as if he were waiting for a door to open. One afternoon, while tending the convent garden, a traveling friar visited. He was a weathered man who managed plantations for absentee owners. He needed a sharp, literate young man to be his assistant, someone who could keep accounts, mediate disputes, and learn the business. He saw potential in Isaias' steady gaze. "It's hard work, son," the friar said, "but it's honest, and it will take you places. You can make something of yourself." Isaias, now 18, felt the first click of destiny. He said yes. For years he traveled with the friar, from estate to estate. He learned about cotton yields and slave management, but he also saw the deep, rotten core of the system. He saw Leah's everywhere women with empty eyes and stories locked behind their teeth. His own vague longing began to take shape, a desire for a place, for roots, for a truth to anchor him. Fate, it seemed, was preparing him. The friar, growing old, received a letter. An acquaintance, a Master Shaniano of Magnolia Grove, needed a new overseer. The previous one had taken ill. The friar, knowing Isaias was more than ready, recommended his protégé in the strongest terms. Magnolia Grove, Isaias repeated, the name stirring something deep, like a forgotten scent on the wind. He accepted the position. He did not know he was traveling not toward a job, but toward the epicenter of his own soul's earthquake. The dust cloud announced his arrival. Isaias reined in his horse at the edge of the Magnolia Grove yard, his posture erect, his clothes simple but well made. He observed everything, the layout of the fields, the condition of the fences, the faces of the enslaved people pausing in their work. He felt a peculiar tightening in his chest, a sense of déjà vu so strong it was disorienting. Geronimo met him with a scrutinizing glare. "You the new foreman? You're young." "Age manages poorly, sir," Isaias replied, his voice calm and firm. "Skill and fairness do better. I am Isaias. I have my letters from Friar Bernard." Geronimo grunted, disarmed by the young man's undeniable authority. The news traveled to the big house. Shaniano, feeling a strange urgency, came out onto the veranda. When Isaias turned to look at him, removing his hat, the master's world tilted. The sun lit the young man's features, the strong jaw, the particular curve of the brow, the steady gray-blue eyes. It was like seeing his own ghost, perfected by time and trial. Shaniano's heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the railing to steady himself. Isaias felt the intensity of the stare but misinterpreted it as simple scrutiny. "Master Shaniano," he said with a respectful nod, "I am ready to begin." In the weaving shed, Leah felt a sudden, violent flutter in her heart, a physical pull so strong she dropped her shuttle. She moved to the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest, and then she saw him. Disciplining herself, she looked away, but her eyes were drawn back. The way he stood, the tilt of his head, a memory, long buried and sensory, surged the feel of a tiny, fair-skinned cheek against her lips. Her feet moved of their own accord. She found herself at the edge of the yard as Isaias passed by, inspecting the quarters. He paused, noting the poor conditions with a frown. His gaze fell upon Leah. He saw an older woman, her face lined with hardship, but her eyes held a universe of sorrow and a light that arrested him. He felt a jolt of connection, profound and inexplicable. He approached. "Good day," he said, his voice softer now. "Is there anything you need here? Any repairs?" Leah could not speak. Her breath hitched. She reached out a trembling hand, not to take his, but almost to touch the air around him. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. From her bedroom window, Estella witnessed the scene. She saw the young foreman's face in full profile, and the world dissolved into a nightmare of truth. She saw Leah's reaction, the unguarded raw recognition, the carefully constructed fiction of her life that the past could be sold and forgotten shattered. The child was gone, but the man he had become was here, and he was looking. At the woman Estella had tried to destroy with a natural, unforced respect. Estella's legs gave way. She sank to the floor of her room, the weight of her sin finally, physically crushing her. The judgment had not come with fire and brimstone, but on horseback, with calm eyes and a ledger book. It had walked right through her front gate. The plantation existed in a state of suspended tension. Isaias proved to be a capable, if unconventional, overseer. He enforced discipline but was never cruel. He listened to grievances about rations and workload with a fair ear, often implementing small improvements that baffled and irritated Geronimo, but earned him the cautious respect of the enslaved people. He felt unnervingly that he was meant to be here, that this land whispered to him in a language half-remembered. His interactions with Leah were brief but charged. He would find reasons to pass by the weaving shed, to ask about the patterns. She would answer in few words, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes drinking him in as if he were water in a desert. One afternoon he found her struggling to lift a heavy bolt of cloth. He stepped in and lifted it for her. "Thank you, Isaias," she said, his name a prayer on her lips. "You know my name?" he asked gently. "The wind carries names," she whispered cryptically, then quickly looked away. "It is a good name, a strong name." In the big house, Shaniano was unraveling. He called Isaias to his study for reports, but would spend the meetings staring, lost in a vortex of regret. One evening, after a discussion about crop rotation, Shaniano's composure broke. The young man was turning to leave when Shaniano blurted out, "Your mother?" Isaias turned, puzzled. "I never knew her, sir. I was raised by the Sisters of Mercy." The answer, delivered with such simple dignity, was a knife to Shaniano's heart. The man his son had become, educated, principled, strong, was a testament not to him but to his absence. He was the product of charity and grace, not paternal legacy. Shaniano began, the words of confession clawing at his throat. "I have made terrible mistakes." Isaias regarded him, his gaze clear and unwavering. It held no anger, only a profound, unsettling understanding. "We all live with the consequences of our choices, Master Shaniano," he said quietly. "Some consequences are just more visible than others." It was neither forgiveness nor accusation. It was a simple statement of cosmic law. Shaniano felt the last of his spirit break. He took to his bed that night and did not rise again. The doctor called it a failure of the heart, and he was not wrong. Shaniano died with his secret, his legacy a prosperous plantation and a living son who would never call him father. On his deathbed, in a moment of late clarity, he had summoned his lawyer. A new will was drawn. It left Magnolia Grove, its lands, and its people, to my trusted foreman, Isaias, for his faithful service, knowing he will administer it with justice. It was the closest he could come to an acknowledgement, a desperate attempt to pay a debt with gold. The reading of the will sent shock waves through the county. A former slave orphan, now the master? Estella, already a ghost of her former self, received the news in her stark white chapel. She did not protest. In Isaias, she saw the living instrument of a justice she now accepted as deserved. She retired to a small cottage on the estate's edge, spending her days in the chapel, her prayers no longer for social grace, but for a mercy she knew she might not receive. Isaias stood on the veranda of the big house, the deed in his hand. He felt no triumph, only an immense, sobering responsibility. He looked out over the land that was now his, the fields, the quarters, the people. He thought of Sister Matilda's lessons, of Friar Bernard's mentorship, of the silent, aching look in Leah's eyes. He did not move into the master's bedroom. Instead, his first act was to summon every soul on Magnolia Grove to the yard. He stood on the veranda steps, the people before him, the enslaved, the house servants, the few white hired hands. "My name is Isaias," he began, his voice carrying clear in the quiet. "This place is now mine by law, but no man should own another." He paused, letting the words hang. "As of this moment, the bonds of legal servitude on Magnolia Grove are nullified. You are free. Those who wish to stay and work these lands will do so as paid tenants, with a share of the crop they sow. Those who wish to leave may go with my blessing, and enough provision to start their journey." A stunned silence was followed by a wave of disbelief, then tears, then muted, hopeful murmurs. He then turned to the oldest, most stooped woman in the front, her eyes shining with a light he had always seen but never understood until this very second. "Leah," he said, walking down to her. He took her work-worn hands in his. "This house, it needs a heart. It needs a keeper of its true history. Will you help me give it a new purpose?" Leah, overwhelmed, could only nod, her tears falling freely now, tears of a pain finally acknowledged, of a loss partially healed. Isaiah's vision was radical. The big house was not to be a home for a new master. He had the fine furniture sold. In the grand dining room, he installed rows of wooden benches and slates. He turned Magnolia Grove into a school, the first of its kind in the region, for the children of the freed tenants and any from the surrounding area who dared to come. On the wall of the main classroom, where Shaniano's portrait once hung, he placed a painting he commissioned from a traveling artist. It showed a woman with Leah's face, strong and serene, holding a sleeping infant, her chin resting gently on his head. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "The First Teacher. From her womb, our future." Leah lived out her days in a sun-drenched room in the big house, not as a servant, but as the school's matriarch, telling stories of resilience to wide-eyed children. She died. Peacefully, with Isaias her son in spirit, now in truth holding her hand, the old, worn rosary beads she had prayed over for decades nestled in her palm. Years later, visitors to the Magnolia Grove School would speak of the strange, peaceful atmosphere. They would note the proud, quiet man who ran it, and the bell in the old white chapel that sometimes seemed to toll of its own accord on misty mornings, a slow, deep, resonant sound. Some said it was the wind. The older folks, the descendants of those who remembered, would just smile. They knew it was the sound of a chain finally falling away, and of a love, once severed, now humming through the very roots of the land, unbroken for all time. If this story of resilience and the unbreakable bonds of love moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Tales Through Time for more journeys into the heart of history's untold stories. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Your community helps us bring these narratives to light.